Hi, this is Jeff Juris. I'm an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I study social movements by actually embedding myself with activists and studying them from the inside. Today we're going to be talking about the Occupy movement, which is a global movement that started on Wall Street to challenge the growing inequality and growing influence of money in our politics, among other things. And the movement has since spread to countries around the world. And today I'm going to be taking your questions via Twitter and Facebook. And we actually have a first question that came in beforehand that asks, how did the Occupy movement start and why now? So I think for this one we have to look at two contexts. One is the domestic context and the other is the global context. I think domestically we have to look at the movement in the context of the 2008 economic crisis, where we had a serious mortgage default crisis and a bubble bursting on Wall Street that had a really terrible impact on the economy. And I think a lot of people felt that the big banks were bailed out, but not enough was done for everyday people on Main Street or middle-class people. And what happened right after that is you had the rise of the Tea Party movement. And they were able to shift the discussion away from regulating Wall Street and away from addressing some of the core problems in the economy like jobs, unemployment, or inequality, and really shifting the focus toward budget deficits, right, and cutting the budget and balancing the budget. And I think that all came to a head with the debate a few months ago about increasing the debt ceiling, when the Republicans said in order to do that, we're going to make you enforce a draconian set of budget cuts or budgetary austerity measures. And I think people were sort of watching this and saying, hey, but you know, what really is concerning to us is that we don't have jobs. Right? We have to talk about unemployment and why bank CEOs are doing so well and we're not doing so well. So I think this frustration just kind of boiled over and is expressing itself now in this movement. But the other thing is there's a global context. And last spring we saw a series of inspirational movements in countries like Egypt and Tunisia and all around the Middle East struggling for basic rights of democracy. And I think people were inspired by that in other countries. There wasn't necessarily a direct connection, although there's been some communication, but really it's a question of inspiration. And then in Spain, in May of this past year, there was a similar movement to the Occupy movement that sprung up called the movement of the indignados, or the indignants. And they were also upset about the budget crisis and how it was affecting everyday people and the inability of the political system to do something about it. So what they did is they, after a big march one day, a group of protesters in Madrid decided to occupy the Plaza de Sol, and they decided to camp out there, and they stayed for weeks. And they organized assemblies, and they began to talk about problems and reach out to the neighborhoods. And so they created really a model that has been reproduced here in the US, and there were some direct contacts between the movement in Spain and the movement here. Movements like that spread to other countries like Israel, and these kinds of assemblies sprung up in Greece, where they were also protesting against budgetary austerity measures. And so what specifically happened here was in July, a group called Adbusters put out a call for an occupation of Wall Street. And given the context I was talking about, activists in New York got really excited about that, and they responded. And on September 17th, I believe, they did the first occupation. They tried to occupy a space right in front of Wall Street and were moved to Zuccotti Park, where the movement has been ever since. And since then, activists around the country and now other cities in the world have set up similar kinds of encampments around this idea of we are the 99%, right? So they also created a frame that was resonant and people really responded to that pointed to these issues of inequality and some of the root problems at the cause of the current crisis. So it looks like I have another question from Twitter, and it's asking, what is the protesters' message? And as in, what are they protesting and what do they want? All right, this has been a controversial question in the media, with a lot of people saying the protesters have no message or they're confused. And I actually disagree with that. And I think a lot of the media analysis has come around as well. When I go down to Occupy Boston, for example, and talk to people, or when I read about the movement, I hear three kinds of concerns. Right? The first is really a concern, as I was saying before, about the bailout of the banks, the bailout of Wall Street. Right? So they, we take all the risks and they reap all the rewards. Right? At the same time, not enough is done to bail out everyday people. Right? Particularly people who got involved in loans that were often pushed on them and they weren't capable of repaying. And so there's a sense of inequity. And so the movement is at its core talking about a need to respond to the economic and social needs of everyday citizens and not to the people with the money on Wall Street. And that relates to a second concern about the influence of the big banks and big money on politics. Right? People look at our political system and they say, it's really incapable of addressing these core issues for some reason, right? And they begin to look at the impact of lobbying and money in politics. And so people really want to, in addition to specific policies, really kind of reinvigorate our democracy so that everyday people can have a voice. And when people are shut out of institutional channels, they often take to the streets. And so you see that in Occupy Wall Street. And I think finally, there's also a sense that the economic model that we've been following for the past 30 years or so since Reagan has really failed not only working class and poor people, but increasingly middle class people. It's kind of hit up against the limit. We have such levels of inequality now that not only is that unfair, it also makes it really difficult for the economy to grow and to create jobs. So we're kind of stuck. So there's also an increasing critique of the overall model and a kind of desire to start a conversation and to move somewhere else. And so, in terms of the specific demands, I think one of the important things to understand about this movement is that there's a diversity of people involved with diverse viewpoints. And so it's very difficult to come up with a specific list. Really what this movement is about is a moral call to take questions of inequality and poverty seriously. Okay, so the next question that came in earlier today, have the protesters and the Occupy movement made any measurable progress? That's another question that I often get, and there are different ways of looking at it. I think movements often have short-term goals and long-term goals. And so if we look at the short-term goals, one of the things that movements try to do is to shine a light on problems and issues that weren't being talked about. And so if we look at the Occupy movement in that sense, I think it's already had a positive impact. As I was saying, after the crisis of 2008, all the talk was around cutting the budget and austerity. And since the Occupy movement has come out, people are now talking about inequality. They're talking about the need to create jobs, right? Even someone like Eric Cantor, a Republican, has to say that inequality is an important problem. That's kind of unprecedented in U.S. political discourse. And I think a lot of that has to do with the movement. In terms of more intermediate range goals and specific policy victories, that comes later. And it often comes through the work of more organized groups, not necessarily within the Occupy movement per se, but allied with the movement, with elected officials in Congress, pushing through proposals. We see now the discussion in the committee that was set up after the discussion about the deficit limit, and I'm sure they're feeling the impact now of the pressure to address things like inequality. So I think over time you'll see some of those kinds of impacts. And then there's the more far-reaching impact. As I was saying, this movement is also about reinvigorating our democracy, about helping to get rid of the influence of big money in politics, about helping everyday people have a voice, have a say in how the country and the economy is run. That takes time, and I think you're seeing the movement experimenting with different models for doing that at the various encampments, and I think it started a discussion that over the next few years I think may lead to changes in that direction. All right, so here's a question from Facebook. How were so many people able to organize and mobilize so quickly? I think this brings us to the question of social media. Right? I've been studying the impact of new media and movements for a long time. I did a lot of work with something called the global justice movement that arose in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that movement was using the internet and listservs and websites. And those technologies really helped the movement organize more quickly than ever before, reach people around the world like never before, and organize in a decentralized way, right, without the need for a big central bureaucracy. I think with the rise of social media and Twitter and Facebook, those kinds of impacts are even greater than they were. You can, put a notice out on Twitter. You can start sharing messages on Facebook, and using peer-to-peer, what we call small world networks, in a matter of hours, a call for a protest can spread around the globe. And so, it's kind of the flash mob or the smart mob dynamic. And so I think that started happening with the call for the Wall Street protest. Instantly, using social media, people were reaching out not just to other people who are mobilized and other activists, but to their friends, their family members, right? And so social media, even unlike listservs and other kinds of technology, really spread the message throughout society much more deeply and quickly than ever before. So I think that's one of the reasons why the movement has been able to spread so quickly. At the same time, it's really important that the movement occupy a physical space, right? That's how it makes itself known beyond social media and actually gets into the national conversation. So we've got another question here coming up from Twitter. This is a long one. In Boston, the city has been under some scrutiny by the media for its approach to dealing with the occupiers, both for being too lax and for allowing the Boston Police Department to use excessive force. How can cities successfully manage a major, long-lasting protest like the Occupy movement? This is a complicated question. And cities are under different sorts of political pressures. I think the main thing to say is that people and protesters have a basic democratic right to have their voices heard. And that, for me, doesn't mean just marching and during a particular day, but actually occupying public space, recreating civic space, I think is an important part of our democracy. And that's one of the things that the Occupy movement is claiming. And so I think it's important that mayors and other leaders respect that right. And to some extent, cities have done that. But there's also other pressures by people who maybe don't support the movement, or people who think that the movement is blocking public access and public space, and they put pressure on the city to crack down. And sometimes that results in the excessive use of police force. And we saw a lot of criticism of the Boston Police Department a few weeks ago. We saw that in Oakland as well. And so without commenting on the specifics of any given case, I think it's important to understand the complexities of the situation for the leadership and for mayors. But I think as a basic point, protesters and their right to occupy public space in a nonviolent and civil way, make their voices heard, should be respected by the leadership and by the police departments. Here's another question from Twitter. Can the movement realistically achieve the change the protesters are looking for? As I said, I think if you look at movements as trying to achieve short, intermediate, and long-term goals, then I think the answer, at least in the short term, is a resounding yes. I think the movement was basically trying to say, there's a problem here. There's increasing inequality. We are the 99%, and we're being left out of this economy, and the 1% is monopolizing all the benefits and all the gains. And so I think in a very short period of time, using social media, occupying public space, getting their voices heard, they've been able to influence public debate and public discussion in a way that I've actually never seen a movement do before in such a short period of time. I think movements use direct action, use the occupation of public space going back to the civil rights movement and before to do just this, to get their voices heard and to shine a light on an issue. But the speed with which this movement has done this has been impressive. In terms of the intermediate policy goals, I think that's an open question, and we'll have to see. Hopefully there'll be forces that can translate some of this moral outrage and some of the more sort of far-reaching visions into policy outcomes. I don't think that that's actually the role of this movement. I think the movement, again, is a moral movement that puts the issue out there. And to try to focus too much on specific policy goals would risk dividing the movement and subjecting the movement to possible co-optation or being disillusioned if things don't happen. So I think the movement is playing its role, and now it's up to organized forces within institutional politics to really translate this into policy outcomes. And in terms of the long-range goals of actually reinvigorating democracy, that's the most unsure. That'll take the longest time. But we see movements have longer-term cultural impacts. The feminist movement, for example, and the role of women, I think, is a clear case of how a movement over the long term has had a real significant impact. The environmental movement, in terms of changing the values and the way we see our relationship with the planet. I think this movement is posing similar questions about how we view our democracy and our place within it. And over the long term, we'll see what kind of cultural changes will emerge. All right, here's a question from Facebook. How should the Occupy movement handle potentially divisive issues that some people argue should be included in the movement without alienating the broad base that they are trying to mobilize? I think the important thing to understand about this movement, and I haven't talked about it that much yet, is the democratic process through which it's organized. The general assemblies that are organized at encampments all over the country and the world now are really about instituting an alternative process for making decisions and making voices heard. So the way it works is that groups of anywhere from 30 to 2 to 3, I've been at assemblies with 400 people, decide what issues they're going to discuss, and then there's a facilitator that helps people develop proposals, comment on those proposals, even block the proposals if they go against the basic interests of the group. And so it's a consensus process where you're not just doing a majority vote, you're actually getting people to come together, discuss an issue, make compromises, and build a decision that maybe not everybody really loves, but that everybody can live with. That's called consensus process. In this movement in Boston, for example, you don't have to have 100% agreement, you just need 75% agreement. So it's a kind of hybrid system. So basically the idea is everybody's voice has a place to be heard. And that's a really great thing when talking about reinvigorating democracy. And it means that people aren't going to be disillusioned or upset with the movement because they're always going to feel a part of the decisions that are made. On the other hand, it does make it difficult for this kind of movement to really engage with contentious issues in a way that brings people together who have very different viewpoints. So certain questions of tactics or questions of specific demands are more difficult for a movement like this to address and to come to an agreement on. So I think that's why you see a lot of those contentious issues sort of left out of some of the decisions that are being made. On the other hand, there are processes in place where people are trying harder and harder to sort of be able to discuss these issues and incorporate them and come up with agreements that are able to address these sorts of things. All right, so another question from Facebook. How does the Occupy movement compare to rallies of the 60s and 70s? For example, the civil rights movement forced the legislature to act. Does the Occupy movement possess that power? It's a great question, a complicated question. Thinking about the movements of the 60s and 70s, there were actually a diversity of movements that came together. I think the civil rights movement was sort of the big initial movement that got things going, that kicked everything off. But over time, that also helped start the student movement, right? The free speech movement in Berkeley, the movement against the Vietnam War, later the feminist movement. So it was a whole cycle of protest, and different movements had different dynamics. So the civil rights movement, one of the things that it did, in some ways it was similar to the Occupy movement in that activists were using direct action tactics. They were using their bodies. They were sort of putting their bodies where they don't belong, as Marshall Gans said in a talk not too long ago. So the lunch counters, right? Young activists would, break the rules of segregation by putting their bodies where they weren't supposed to be, and that would generate a great deal of repression by local Southern whites, by the police, and that sort of moral contradiction of people exercising their basic democratic rights, counterposed with the sort of violence and repression of the opposing forces, gave the movement a lot of legitimacy. And other tactics like the Freedom Summer in Mississippi or the Freedom Rides were able to put a lot of pressure on the federal government to enforce the basic civil rights laws that in some sense were already on the books, and they were forced eventually to enact a civil rights law that enshrined people's basic rights to vote and to occupy public space and so forth. So that's the civil rights movement, and I think what the Occupy movement is borrowing is a long tradition in U.S. politics of civil disobedience and using the body. And so I think the civil rights movement, the legacy is very much alive. In terms of other movements, the student movement was focusing on questions of democracy, was focusing on questions of universities and knowledge and access. The anti-war movement was focused on ending the war in Vietnam. So in some sense, those were similar movements in that they were decentralized, they were led by young people, they were moral movements. But they also had, I think, a more easily recognizable legislative target. For the civil rights movement, it was the right to vote. I mean, it wasn't only that, but that became sort of the rallying cry. The movement against the Vietnam War, obviously, ending the war. This movement, the Occupy movement, I think is addressing, in some sense, a more complex set of issues, or at least a set of issues that are more difficult to sort of boil down to a 3-second soundbite. And so in that sense, it's maybe harder to measure the kind of impact that it will have. And so in terms of the legislative impact, as I was saying before, I think it can have a legislative impact, but I think it's an indirect impact. People, elected officials, will have to take up some of the issues that the movement's talking about and then translate that into action. And you know, it took the civil rights movement a number of years before the civil rights law was passed. It took, you know, the anti-war movement. In some sense, the war in Vietnam didn't end until later in the 70s. And so it takes movements a long time to have an impact. And so we'll just have to wait and see what kind of impact this movement has. All right, question from Facebook. You said you embed yourself with protesters. What happens at the camps and what is it like there? Yeah, that's a great question. And I would actually encourage each of you as a kind of, you know, as students and as a learning exercise to go down to the camps and see what happens there and talk to people. It's a really valuable experience. So the camp, first of all, it's a kind of self-managed city. Right? It has a very complex structure. Right? Sometimes people talk about these movements as unorganized. Right? This is an extremely highly organized movement where you have different tents and sections in the camp. So you have, for example, a media tent with people who talk to the mainstream press and who operate the Twitter account and who have their own alternative media. There's actually a newspaper there called Occupy Boston Globe. There's a huge kitchen space where people cook food for the campers and take donations. There's a logistical space where people sit and help to organize the camp and help people coming in to know how to plug in and new people to know where to set up their tents. There's a People's University there where people are organizing workshops and classes. There's a meditation tent if you want to go and sit and have a few minutes of quiet. So there are all these different spaces in the camp. And there are working groups that organize everything. And so on a daily basis, you know, what happens is, you know, you wake up and people, you know, get out of their tent. They maybe, you know, get washed. A lot of people are, you know, say using the bathroom in South Station. I know that there are other places to take showers around Boston that people are offering. You know, people have meetings. There's breakfast. People eat. Go about their activities, and then throughout the day, there's just an endless array of things happening. Workshops. Again, the People's University has classes about the economic crisis, about democracy, direct action, about how to reach out to communities of color, for example, is an issue that people talk about a lot. There are different caucuses. There's a women's caucus that meets. There's an anarchist caucus that meets. There's a people of color caucus. So there are different groupings within the camp that meet. And so there are workshops all day. And then in the evenings, I think 4 days a week now, there's a big General Assembly where a couple hundred people get together, again, sometimes up to 300-400 people, and talk about both issues in terms of the camp, but also sort of issues about how to reach out to the community, how to refine the message. So there are kind of practical issues and political issues. On nights when there are no General Assemblies, some of the working groups have their meetings to talk about specific things. There's cultural events. So, you know, the last few times I've been spending time there are people singing, playing guitar. So there's music, there are DJs set up, there are parties at the camp. So really it's a whole life world. And it's important to also keep in mind that it's not just life at the camp, that all around the city now there are groups meeting in local neighborhoods, in churches, in communities, talking about the same issues that are being raised at the camp. So the camp provides kind of a focal point for the movement where you can always go down and find out what's happening. There's also a space to make art and signs, and so People are always holding up signs for the cars that are passing by. So that's really the visible center of the movement. But there's also this subterranean movement where people out of the public view are meeting together and talking and coming up with proposals. All right, so here is a question from Twitter. How long will the movement last? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I get a lot of questions about the winter and what's going to happen when the winter comes. And there's a number of different ways to answer that. I mean, first of all, it's important to point out that I think a lot of people are committed to staying over the winter. There's a winterization committee, and people are talking about how to reinforce their tents and how to keep warm throughout the winter and how to keep a presence in the square. At the same time, there are other discussions and plans being made. I don't have all the information, and I think nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But there's talk of maybe going inside, whether that's occupying a space or using a donated space. And a lot of people are talking about the importance of really reaching out to the community and using the winter months as an opportunity to do outreach, particularly to people who maybe don't have the time to go and sleep over at the camp. Maybe you're older, maybe you have kids, have a full-time job, and so you feel that you're part of the movement, but you just can't be at the actual camp. I think the winter months are a time to reach out to more and more people like that. And then I think there's a lot of excitement about when the spring comes, having another big public kind of expression of the movement where people will come back to the plaza, to Dewey Square. That's in Boston. I know at other camps around the country, there are places where there is no winter, right? So if you're in Tampa, Florida, for example, or Los Angeles, I think the movement can go on. But there are other reasons to be concerned, I think, about the sustainability of a movement, though. In work that I've done in other social movements, there's often a cycle. Right? Movements are often about emotion and passion. And one of the reasons this movement took off so quickly is that that it resonated so powerfully with people. And there's always a concern that over time, the movement becomes routine, the novelty wears off, the media lose interest, and people lose energy. And I think that's a concern for any movement, and this movement as well. And so I think the important thing is having the occupation and recognizing what that does in terms of visibility, but thinking about other strategies, longer-term strategies, building relationships with the community, right? Talking about issues that affect people in their everyday lives. The movement, I think, viscerally connects to people, and it's about translating that into sort of more sustainable long-range goals while not losing the impact, I think, of the visibility of the occupations. So I think the movement, one outcome is that it does sort of lose strength and dissipates over the winter. And even if that happens, as I said before, I think the movement will have succeeded in shifting the discussion. I think more likely is that the movement continues and that it continually shifts, and that maybe it does lose some of the public visibility over time, but it begins to build more outside the public view, and that with that increased strength, occasionally it will come back with sort of greater strength. So the movement itself will become cyclical, and I think that's a sort of more likely outcome, but we'll just have to wait and see. All right, this is the last question from Facebook. Going forward, will this movement have any effect on the presidential election next year? I think the movement will inevitably have an impact, but it won't necessarily be a direct impact, as I was saying. I doubt you'll see the movement endorsing a particular candidate. I don't think the movement is set up to do something like that. I think that would be very divisive. I also think people realize the power of having it be a kind of nonpartisan movement in the sense that it's raising issues that are of concern to everyone. That said, I think because it has shifted or helped to shift the discussion, I think you are going to hear talk about the 99%. You're going to hear a lot more discussion about inequality. You're going to hear a lot more discussion about jobs. And when candidates are putting proposals on the table, there's going to be people in the streets organizing around these issues. So I think inevitably it's going to affect the discussions that happen in the campaign, particularly during the debates. I think you're going to see a lot of questions about that. But I wouldn't expect to see a real direct impact in terms of a relationship with a particular candidate or party, and I think that's a good thing for the movement. But I think it will impact the broader discussion that happens around the campaign. This has been really fun for me. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, And feel free to contact me directly at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology if you want to have further discussions about this movement or any related issues.